This is VOA Africa.
Hello, I'm Esther Githui-Ewart. It's Monday, June 15th. This is Africa 54. Due to the global outbreak of COVID-19, Voice of America is taking every necessary precaution to safeguard its employees. So our broadcast will look a little different today and in the near future as we, out of an abundance of caution, reduce our staffing at VOA headquarters here in Washington. We're working to help keep you informed about what's going on and appreciate your staying with us on Africa 54. Residents in the southern U.S. city of Atlanta are on edge Monday after a white police officer shot dead Rayshard Brooks Friday outside a fast food restaurant. The killing is the latest in a string of deaths of African-American men that has prompted nationwide protests seeking to address police misconduct and systematic racism. A medical examiner in Fulton County, Georgia, has ruled Brooks' death a homicide. Brooks was cooperating with police officers during a sobriety test, but then struggled with the officers as they tried to arrest him and ran. The medical examiner's autopsy found that Brooks was shot in the back twice and died from organ damage and blood loss. The shooting set off a day of protests in Atlanta Saturday that started peacefully but turned violent. Demonstrators tried to block an interstate highway, and the Wendy's restaurant where Brooks was shot was burned to the ground. Police officer Garrett Rolfe has been fired, and the Atlanta police chief, Erica Shields, has resigned. A second officer, Devin Brosnan, has been placed on administrative leave. Meanwhile, protesters are planning to gather Monday in Atlanta, the state capital of Georgia, demanding criminal justice reforms and measures to address election problems. The deadly police shooting in Atlanta is further fueling unrest and demonstrations against racism and police brutality. As VOA's Ken Faribault reports, the call for bipartisan legislation addressing police reform nationwide is growing as protests across the country and world enter their third week.
On Friday night, Atlanta police officers approached 27-year-old Rayshard Brooks, who appeared to be asleep behind the wheel of his car while waiting in line at a fast food restaurant drive-thru. When officers tried to detain Brooks, he resisted arrest, leading to a scuffle. In the moments that followed, recorded in a series of police body cameras, restaurant surveillance footage, and bystander cell phone videos, Brooks appears to use one of the officers' tasers as he flees. The incident ends when one of the officers opens fire, leading to Brooks' death.
I firmly believe that there is a clear distinction between what you can do and what you should do. I do not believe that this was a justified use of deadly force and have called for the immediate termination of the officer.
A day later, the officer who pulled the trigger was fired. The Atlanta police chief resigned, and the fast food restaurant where the incident occurred was engulfed in flames as anger over Brooks' death led to unrest on the streets of Atlanta, in a country already on edge in the wake of previous deadly police encounters.
We need reformation of how police officers do their jobs, how law enforcement does its job. Because what happened yesterday to Rayshard Brooks was a function of excessive force and the decision that the fact that they were either embarrassed or, panicked led them to murder a man who they knew only had a taser in his hand.
It's a disconnect lawmakers in Washington are increasingly under pressure to resolve with bipartisan legislation that addresses police reform, especially in the wake of the recent death of George Floyd in police custody in Minneapolis. Republican Senator James Lankford from Oklahoma says he would support a ban on police use of chokeholds.
There's been a consensus document that was done in 2017 by law enforcement around the country to say that that is not needed. So I think that's not an issue for us.
Former New Jersey governor and Republican candidate for president in 2016, Chris Christie, points to successes in police reform in the city of Camden, New Jersey, as an example for other communities to follow.
We got police officers out of their cars, onto bicycles, on foot, and embedded them in the community, both from a law enforcement perspective and socially, George, working with the communities and working with young men and women in the communities to develop trust. Second was de-escalation training. And the watchword for the de-escalation training is first do no harm.
While lawmakers in Washington seek to find common ground on legislation, some states have already passed sweeping police reforms in response to the protests that have dominated headlines across most American cities over the last several weeks. Kane Fairbaugh, VOA News.
Since the May 25th death of George Floyd while in police custody, Americans have been protesting in the streets and renewing calls for reforms in police departments nationwide. One movement that has garnered national attention has been to defund the police. VOA's International Edition Steve Miller spoke to Dr. David Thomas, a forensic studies professor at Florida Gulf Coast University. Dr. Thomas is an expert in policing in America and a veteran police officer specializing in mental health, police, and minority relations. Steve began their conversation by asking Dr. Thomas what he thought the role of the police should be in American society.
The role here in America is a very diverse role. When I started, all it was in 1978, the job was people violated the law. It was put those violators in jail. It evolved, and I can tell you because I started in 78 and I retired in 1998. So I've kind of gone through each one of these decades with this understanding. And somewhere in the 80s, when they let everybody out of the mental institutions and they just turned them loose on the streets, we all of a sudden became health workers with no training. Today, there's some training, but there's no training. And we are responsible for making an assessment of somebody, if they're a threat to themselves or somebody else, and then transporting them. The 90s was going on. We still were doing the same thing, but we got better educated. You know, policing now, you know, CIT, which is officers are trained to be able to respond and deal with critical people who are in mental health crisis and have those conversations with them. After 9/11, the mission changed. Oh, let's go back. We had community policing. It afforded us an opportunity to get out of patrol cars. It was funded by the federal government where agencies could actually write grants. And then as a result of those grants, you had people that were assigned to do nothing but community police.
So given your expertise, given your experience, you know, what should the job, in your opinion, be?
It has to be a little bit of all, because there's one other thing that I got to kind of throw into this pot. 9/11 changed everything. The police mission changed from being, you know, like agencies wanted to be in partnership with their communities to actually having a responsibility to responding to terrorism. And so that meant that all the money that went in community policing that came from the federal government, it went into those efforts. The way I look at policing today, it should be a mixture of all of those things.
So I want to ask you this. So, you know, a lot of protest time is given to this notion of the chant, defund the police. Some rephrase it as reimagining of police forces, looking at municipalities, redistributing the funds. So, you know, with this topic in mind, where do you respond to those kinds of discussions?
Whew. When they talked about defunding, when I heard of defunding, and I have several friends that are chiefs, and you can only imagine, my phone just blew up. What are they talking about? They're crazy, you know. And I'm sitting here thinking, because we physically could not reimagine that what would happen if you said, okay, defunding to us means that you want to do away with us. We have dismantled one department in New Jersey, and that department rebuilt itself, Camden, New Jersey. And they did that with the idea that they could if they dismantled it and reorganized it, then what would happen is they could get rid of all the bad officers that have been protected by the union and a bunch of other things, and you had to reapply. New rookies coming in, they got to get out, they got to go walk on foot and knock on doors and go talk to people. They got to work a community. So when we talk about defunding, so I'm in one sense I'm adamantly opposed, but here's the rub. As I look and do research, I recognize that there are agencies that have mental health clinicians that are a part of their system and actually respond to calls. I foresee that as being the change, and a much needed change. Money is always going to be the issue.
So without consent decrees, without learning the lessons from the 1960s, the 1990s with Rodney King, the current issues with minority relations, you may not have the solution, but what is your best guess for moving forward?
I think I don't think it's not you can't leave local problems to be local problems. So the greatest way to handle this issue would probably be state oversight, to create something just like the Justice Department did when they had consent decrees, to be able to have independent people come in, do the investigation, look at the data sets and say, okay, this is what has to happen. And the state actually takes those agencies to court and hold them, and they can do the same thing and hold them accountable through some sort of decree that is done at the state level. Then you don't need outside, you don't need the whole outside thing from the federal government. The other side of that is, if agencies are smart at this point, what they should be doing is reaching out to the community and having those conversations. And I don't mean the chiefs of police, because the chief sees it one way, and they have this the way they want their department to run. But the line guys, like I used to be, they need to be sitting in those meetings and having those conversations with people to understand what the people feel and what they see.
That was VOA Steve Miller speaking with Dr. David Thomas, a forensic studies professor at Florida Gulf Coast University. The role of the U.S. military is also under intense scrutiny amid civil unrest erupting in the United States. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Bob explores the importance of the military's long tradition of remaining apolitical in order to best represent and protect the American people it serves.
The use of force against peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square by federal law enforcement, backed by the U.S. military's National Guard, sparked a nationwide debate about the role of the military in civil society.
And it created an image, I think, that I think, again, gets after this idea of eroding the trust and confidence of the military.
General Joseph Votel, the former commander of U.S. Central Command, who now serves on the executive board of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, tells VOA the military's core value to stay out of domestic politics is among its greatest assets.
It is one of the very important reasons why the American military remains the most respected institution in America.
Several retired top-ranking officers have spoken out after a presidential threat to deploy thousands of active duty troops to U.S. cities, a move intended for only the most extreme circumstances. And this audio leak of Defense Secretary Mark Esper speaking to governors about the protests.
And so, at my urging, I agree, we need to dominate the battle space.
When we can focus on the potential conflict in terms of dominating our own cities and our own people, it scares me to death, quite frankly. And if we don't do something about it, we'll look back and recognize this moment as this was the moment where really we need to do something.
Esper and the top U.S. military officer also walked in Lafayette Square with the president moments before he posed for photos outside a nearby church damaged during protests the night before. Pentagon officials have stressed that neither Milley nor Defense Secretary Esper knew of the president's plans and had only agreed to go to the square to thank National Guard members for their service. Esper has said he regretted his battle space comments, and Milley on Thursday called his decision to accompany the president in the square a, quote, mistake that he had learned from.
I should not have been there. My presence in that moment and in that environment created a perception of the military involved in domestic politics.
The military's apolitical nature is more than a tradition. It's in the military oath of office taken by every service member.
They're not swearing to support and defend the president, any president, whether he or she be Republican or Democrat. They're swearing to support and defend the Constitution.
Former officials have raised concerns that the president oftentimes ignores or forgets this very point.
The president has been really accumulating a sense of ownership about the government, where he makes statements about this is my military, or my generals, or my judges.
And with a presidential election less than 5 months away, some worry that the current debate about the military's role in domestic issues won't be the last.
The military is going to be really tested because this president will try to draw them into his political agenda.
Carla Babb, VOA News, Washington.
We're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the discussion on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our broadcast live on Facebook. Please watch and share our show with your friends. Also check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Still to come, in the midst of treating coronavirus patients and restrictions on outside activities, a South African doctor runs and completes a marathon. We'll be right back after this break.
Hello, I'm Linor Moudou, your VOA Health correspondent. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Health Organization says the best way to reduce your chances of being infected or spreading coronavirus is to wear a mask to avoid breathing any small liquid droplets which may contain the virus. Regularly wash your hands with soap and water or clean your hands with an alcohol-based hand sanitizer. For more information on COVID-19, visit who.int or contact your local or national health authorities.
Welcome back to Africa 54. Like many countries, France is witnessing a public awakening on the issue of police violence and racial profiling sparked by the death of George Floyd in the United States. In northern Paris, one group of judicial experts and activists are working with minority youngsters, teaching them their rights and how to interact with the police and the communities they live in. Lisa Brandt in Paris has that story.
2 nights a week, this Paris Community Center opens its doors to neighborhood youngsters, giving them a place to hang out and to get advice.
We try to make these youngsters understand the police controls are unlawful and impact their future. It's not normal they are targeted because of their appearance.
Here and in other poor neighborhoods of France, relations between police and minority youngsters can be explosive. It's a long-standing problem. 15 years ago, riots spread across low-income housing projects after 2 teens died fleeing police. During the coronavirus lockdown, activists say young Black and ethnic Arab men faced disproportionately more police checks and abuse. In April, violence flared in several Paris suburbs after a motorcyclist was injured when he crashed into a police car.
The confinement was hot. The police chased us. We had more checks. They would find us straight away.
Now, George Floyd's death in the United States has touched off a powder keg. Thousands are defying a coronavirus ban against gatherings and calling for justice. Another name resounding here is 24-year-old Adama Traore, who died in 2016 after being restrained by police. The cause of his death is disputed, but Traore's family draws parallels with Floyd's. Like in the U.S., the protests are about more than police violence.
I'm here for many reasons: inequality and racism against blacks, police violence. We want to have more rights.
French authorities say they will ban a controversial chokehold method to detain suspects. They vow zero tolerance of police abuse, but they deny systemic racism within the force. Rights advocates say the government's response is inadequate.
What's really needed is reimagining the police, rethinking the police, changing police missions, changing the legal framework, accountability. So there needs to be a whole structural reform of the institution, not micro measures.
It hasn't always been this way. During multiple terrorist attacks a few years ago, police were briefly treated as local heroes for protecting and sometimes dying to save people. That seems a long time ago. Today, the French are divided over whether these protests will bring about serious change. Still, some hope that, like in the U.S., this is the start of a bigger conversation about discrimination and race. Lisa Bryant for VOA News, Paris.
Across Europe on Monday, there are more COVID-19 reopenings. Britain, France, Greece and other locations. But China is reimposing some coronavirus restrictions after dozens of new cases surfaced in Beijing. China is reporting 49 new confirmed COVID-19 infections, the majority linked to a wholesale market in Beijing, prompting authorities to reinstitute some social isolation restrictions and suspend plans to restart some classes. Now to Africa, where Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo says Health Minister Kwaku Agyeman Manu is in a stable condition after contracting COVID-19. Ghana has recorded nearly 12,000 positive coronavirus cases, one of the highest in the region, but it has also carried out one of the highest number of tests on the continent at over 254,000 and has one of the lowest number of deaths from the virus. In North Africa, Egypt's health ministry on Sunday confirmed almost 1,700 new COVID-19 infections and 62 deaths, the highest daily increase for both counts. Worldwide, the coronavirus has infected 7.9 million people and killed at least 433,000, according to Johns Hopkins University. VOA reporter Adam Phillips lives in the heart of New York City, the epicenter of COVID-19 in the U.S. He survived lung cancer, which he contracted after inhaling contaminated air from debris following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Adam, who is now recovering from prostate cancer, spoke to me earlier about his weak immune system and his fear of contracting coronavirus.
I'm recovering now from prostate cancer. I had my prostate removed on February 25th, just before the coronavirus crisis really hit big time in New York. And it was fortunate in a way that I had the prostate cancer removed when I did, because after that, the hospitals were functionally closed for most people without COVID. And my own immunosuppressant drugs make me very, very vulnerable to COVID. So it's been kind of a scary ride for me and my family, although I think we're on the other side of it now, even though COVID is still with us.
A lot of people with underlying health issues were very fearful of going to visit doctors. Did you have that fear?
Well, I did actually had a fear of that, and justified, because hospitals are very, very full of infection. I had an infection after my prostate surgery, and my fever was so high that my doctor told me I must go to the emergency room. And when my wife dropped me off, this was in the middle of March, she didn't know if she was going to see me again, because she wasn't allowed to come in with me. And if I did have COVID, it was very possible that I could die there. And so that was a very, very scary moment for us.
Are you able to socialize? Are you able to go out? Are you fearful of, getting infected?
I wear a mask when I go outside. I keep 2 meters distance between me and anybody else.
You've said you were born, bred, and buttered in New York City. Now, let's talk about another health issue that you had to deal with after the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Yes, well, I unfortunately 3 years ago in 2017, I had lung cancer. And both this prostate cancer and the lung cancer that I had before was linked to 9/11, because I was reporting from ground zero for many, many months. I'm right in the center of where all the debris and other things were from the World Trade Center destruction. And so sort of this disaster is sort of linked in my mind to the 9/11 disaster, because it's sort of a continuous problem. The medical issues are a result of that.
Are you going out now to do any reporting?
No. I'm not reporting now at all in person. I'm doing all my interviews on computer and on Zoom and on Skype, such as we're speaking right now. A lot of people can't work from home, and those are the people I really worry about, the people who work in the supermarkets, the delivery people, restaurant workers, all kinds of people that don't have the luxury of working from their house. And I'm very conscious that I'm very fortunate to be able to continue and to have a job at all in these times.
New York has been a very busy city. It's a 24/7 kind of city. It's a buzz all the time. So what is the atmosphere like right now, Adam?
It's a very strange city right now. I mean, I love the city and I feel for it. I mean, there's a lot of grief in the air, partly because of all the deaths. But when you drive around, which I have been doing a little bit, it's unbelievably quiet. There are very, very few people on the streets. I go to Times Square, which is usually just swamped with people. And now it's sort of almost like an empty street.
What are people missing most?
Well, they're missing the concerts, the venues, the restaurants, the bars, the cafes, the street light, the street performers, hanging out together. I mean, New Yorkers are very social people.
So, Adam, we know that a lot of people are not working businesses have closed, and New York City might take even a longer time to reopen, even partially. Do you have any concerns that some people may be evicted and perhaps become homeless?
There's a moratorium, or at least an ease of demanding rent, but that's going to end also. So I'm looking towards some huge numbers of evictions, and the crime will go up because people need to feed their families. And, if they can't get any money from a job and they can't get any help from the government, and they still have stomachs and children that they need to take care of, I think the police are preparing for a lot of problems. The crime figures have actually gone up recently, so maybe that's a trend. One hopes not.
Adam Phillips is a VOA reporter in New York. In our sports news, South African doctor Casey Dick has been on the front line treating coronavirus patients. She and her husband are outdoor enthusiasts and in normal times frequently go camping and take part in an annual Two Oceans Marathon, which has been canceled this year due to the pandemic. To cope with the stress of the work and being stuck at home, the doctor decided to run her own 56 kilometers marathon nonetheless in the parking lot. She and her husband also pitched a tent in their living room where they often spend time. Franco Puglisi reports.
For South African doctors like Casey Dick, working on Africa's front line to fight the COVID-19 pandemic brings lots of stress.
It has been a very emotional time. We've had to make some very difficult decisions as doctors.
As a keen runner, Dr. Dick's normal coping tools were stopped with lockdown measures and Cape Town's cancellation of the annual Two Oceans Marathon. So, Doctor decided to run her own marathon, but with a route not quite as scenic as coastal South Africa's Indian and Atlantic Oceans.
I decided to run the Two Oceans in our parking lot. When everything felt so out of control and unpredictable, I needed that something that I could achieve and that I could just put my mind to.
South Africa lockdown has been a tough challenge for outdoor buffs, Dr. Dick and her partner, Sean Brooks.
Most weekends we were always venturing out or going exploring or hiking or surfing or running or something like that.
So the couple decided to go camping.
Now, of course, we couldn't go into the mountains where we'd rather be, but instead we decided to do it in our lounge. And it was just magical. And then in the morning when the sun rose, we sat in our tent and watched the sunrise. And it was definitely something I will always remember from the lockdown.
South Africa lifting a ban on alcohol sales last week also helped lift their spirit. Franco Puglisi for VOA News, Johannesburg.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thank you for watching.